All right. Okay, so let's get started then. So today, lecture on clarity. So how to write clearly. And I mean, all joking aside, that is actually an issue that comes up a lot. In many ways, I'm going to tell you before I sort of get into sort of the gist of this. In some ways, the problem here is a self-inflicted wound, at least for many students. And by this, what I mean is that the students have the, they feel insecure. And so in order to sort of reassure themselves, they try to write as complex as they can. They try to make themselves sound as sophisticated as they can, because that way they're sure that they don't come off as being naive, silly, unprepared, what have you, right? And so the effect is, because then they can't quite pull it off, it's a problem. And that if they just try to write, as clearly as possible without trying to be more complicated than they have to, it wouldn't be a problem. Okay, so that in that sense, I mean, it's a self-inflicted wound. But so here we're not going to make that assumption. We're going to make the assumption that we really need to address the issue, and it's not something that you can switch on and off at will. All right. So first of all, well, I mean, obviously we need to define our terms, right? So what does it mean to write clearly? Anyone?
Writing that doesn't include ambiguity.
Okay, writing that's not ambiguous. That's good. But is that all? No, there's more to it, right? Anyone? Ideas, thoughts?
It's simple, I mean, easy to understand. Oh, well, it is.
Right, yeah, but that's the problem, is that the dictionary says, oh, well, clear is easy to understand. Good. What's easy to understand? What's clear? So it's a circular definition. So the problem then is, what is it that makes a text difficult to understand? Okay, that is, where does the difficulty lie, right? And that's what we're going to try to do today. Okay, so first of all, we have to distinguish between difficulty of form and difficulty of content. Okay, so you can have difficult content that's in clear form, and you can have easy content that's in difficult form, right? So the two are not necessarily tied. Okay, so let's start with difficulty of form. So this is the way the meaning is presented. The meaning per se is fairly simple, okay? So for example, I can say, this is an example of dyadic verbal communication, right? And that's a pretty complicated thing to understand. Or I can say, it's two people talking. Right? I've expressed exactly the same meaning, okay? But the form is dramatically different in terms of complexity of what I'm saying, right? I mean, do we all agree that dyadic verbal communication is more complex than two people talking?
Yes.
Right, good. But the meaning is exactly the same. The content is exactly the same. Okay, so that's the formal difficulty, the difficulty at the level of the form, right? So the point that I'm trying to make here is that this level of formal difficulty, the formal complexity, may reside at the lexical level, and this would be the example of dyadic instead of two people. Okay, a dyad is two people, right? So, but that's just a lexical replacement, right? If I put two people verbal communication, it's the same thing, right? I mean, I'm saying the same thing. Or it can be at the syntax level, okay? In other words, the complexity is the syntactic structure, right? Okay, so we need to examine then these two possibilities, and as you can see, there's really three ways that syntactic complexity can manifest itself: at the level of constructions, at the level of the complexity of the sentence itself, it can have multiple sentences embedded in it, and at the level of recursion, which I'm sure you're familiar from your English 555 class. Basically, is when you have multiple embeddings in a sentence. We'll look at an example in a minute. All right, so let's look at the vocabulary level, the lexical level. Here's another example. Perspicuity is tantamount to essential in the conveyance of meaning. Okay, so what does that mean? Clarity is crucial for communication, right? So why didn't I just say clarity is crucial for communication? Well, because I was building an example of an unnecessarily complex lexical choice, right? To say perspicuity instead of clarity, it's just picking a more complicated, less common, more archaic word than a simple one. Okay, and often these archaic words come from Latin and Greek. Okay, but they don't have to. One of the things that makes things unnecessarily complex is acronyms. We are so used to them, to a lot of them, like SUV, right? For example, you say, oh, I just bought an SUV, or Bob bought an SUV, right? But what does SUV stand for? Anyone?
Sports utility vehicle.
I'm sorry?
Sports utility vehicle.
Sports utility vehicle. There you go. So you could have said that. All it needed was, spelling out the acronym, right? So if you don't know that, SUV becomes a difficult thing to do. And if you've ever run across an acronym that you didn't know what it was, it's going to be very complicated to figure it out. The first time that I saw the acronym POTUS, which stands for President of the United States, it took me a few minutes of saying, what the hell are they talking about? What's this POTUS that everybody's talking about? Well, it turns out it was the president. All right, But so the point here is that if you know the meaning of the term, of the acronym, of the polysyllabic word, etc., it's fine. But if you don't know it, then you don't know what they're talking about. And that makes it complicated, right? So how do you fix this problem? Well, that's actually easy, because nobody's making you use complex terminology with a gun to your head, right? I mean, that's your choice to do that. So basically, don't use it. Avoid it unless you have to, because it's a technical term and then you need it. But otherwise, just avoid it. Okay. So you don't need to say perspicuity. You can say clarity, right? You don't need to. You don't need to say tantamount to essential. You can say crucial, important, right? You're conveying the same meaning. Now, if you do need a technical term, and an example that I used earlier in a different lecture, if you're talking about Paul Gleich and the theory of cooperation, etc., you're going to need to use the word implicature sooner or later, right? Because that's what it is. So then if you use a technical term like that, you should define it the first time that you use it. Okay, that's a very important rule, and a rule, by the way, that I have to say, students get it wrong. Just, I think, out of not paying attention, because you will have, the word implicature used, and then 5 lines below, you have implicature and then the explanation, right? Or an acronym used, and then 5 lines below, the acronym, and this time it's spelled out, okay? Well, you've got to be careful about that, because if you feel the need to spell it out, then you should have spelled it out the first time that you used it. If you feel the need to define it, then you should define it the first time that you use it. So that's a general rule. Technical terms, acronyms, should be defined on the first use or should not be defined. Okay? So if you say in your paper, I'm doing a paper about prosody, blah, 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 and you say phonemes this, phoneme that, you don't need to define the term phoneme. you can assume that anybody that reads a paper about prosody will know what a phoneme is, right? So you don't need to define it unless you have to. Okay, so if it's a term that can be assumed is known by pretty much everybody who is going to be in your audience, then you don't need to define it at all. You can use it. And again, you should use it only if necessary. All right, so now let's move on to the syntax. Remember I said there were three kinds of syntactic complexity. So the first one, and this is a sort of a boogaboo of the teachers, is the passive. So how many of you have been told avoid the passive? Right? Yeah. Or I prefer to say the passive should be avoided. Thank you very much.
All the time.
Yes. I'll be here all week. All right. So thank you, Shannon. You're a wonderful audience. So why do they say avoid the passive? Okay. Well, the reason for that is actually sort of a backwards thing. That is, you remember what I said about students sort of feeling insecure, and so they use forms that make them sound more academic, more sophisticated, right? So the passive is one of these, because the passive is very common in scientific writing, okay? For a very good reason that we're going to talk about in a second. But so as a result, then you would have things like, high school students who would write, we had a birthday party and great fun was had by everyone, right? I mean, and there, of course, the passive is absolutely pointless, right? Because you could have said everybody had a great time, right? And you don't have to have the passive at all. However, when you're doing scientific writing, you actually, it doesn't make any sense to put a sentence with an agent when it's not important who's going to do it. Okay, so so if you say something like, I need to run an experiment, right? But in fact, it's going to be my graduate student who's going to run the experiment, right? So do I say, Mimi will do the testing? No, I say, the testing will be done, right? Because why would I emphasize the fact that it's someone else who's doing the testing and not me? Okay, so that's the reason why then you use these passives, because they allow you to de-emphasize or even eliminate entirely, in the case of the agentless passive, the agent. Okay, so if you say, the data were tested for erroneous input, right? Who did the testing? Who cares, right? I mean, the point is, I don't want to tell you who did the testing because it doesn't matter, right? It's not relevant whether I did it myself or I hired, a graduate student, a starving graduate student for like a handful of coins or just a half a pizza. And as you see, she says, and we'll take it, right? Yeah, that's exactly my point. So the idea then is, if you don't need to talk about who the agent is, then you use the passive. And because in science there is this idea that you're, writing in the, in a perspective that's universal, that doesn't, it's not a personal, individual pursuit, but it's a more general thing, then they use the passive a lot. Now, because it is used a lot in science, then it became prestigious, and college students started using the passive to make themselves sound more sophisticated, educated, learned, and whatever. And so as a result, then they started using it badly, which is why then high school teachers say, don't use the passive. Okay? But the passive per se has got nothing wrong with it. The passive is perfectly fine. Okay? I mean, there couldn't be a construction in language that was somehow unnecessary. Okay, so the passive is there for a reason. Is that you needed to do certain things. Okay, but you need to be aware that a passive sentence is more complex to process and to understand than an active sentence. It takes more time. It takes more effort. Your brain needs to crank it up a little bit more. The same thing goes for marked constructions. Marked constructions are things like extrapositions or focus on some aspect. If you say it's this hypothesis that we're testing, as opposed to we're testing this hypothesis, right? So you shift the focus on the hypothesis itself that's being tested, right? But then there's other things like, for example, the hypothetical or irrealis construction, which basically indicates a situation that does not hold. It's precisely what they say, a hypothetical, right? That is, you use it when you know that it's not true what you're talking about, but you're saying if we did this, then that, right? So the example that I have there, if one were to build a theory of writing based on linguistics, the heads of English majors would explode, right? So notice that it's were, if one were to, okay? That's not a standard sentence. You don't say in standard English, I mean, in regular sentences, I were to build. You say, I am building, right? So were indicates that it's a hypothetical situation, okay? So technically it's actually the subjunctive, okay? So this is the kind of thing that if you use an irrealis construction, it's gonna make the reading that much more complicated, okay? So again, if you have to do it, but know what you're doing, okay? That is, keep in mind that you're making your text more complicated to process for your reader. Okay. Also, another thing that you want to keep in mind is that in colloquial English, people say "if I was you," and that is technically a grammar mistake. So you want to be careful when you use this irrealis, that you can get yourself in trouble with your teacher because they may mark it as grammatically incorrect. Okay. All right. Now, syntactic complexity, of course, can be when you have a sentence that has either subordination or coordination, or God help us, both at the same time. Okay. So obviously, if you have an embedded sentence within a sentence, it's more complicated to process. That's to be expected, right? Coordination is the same thing. It's not embedded, but it's coordinated precisely, but it makes it harder to read the thing. Why? Because you have to keep in your short-term memory a longer chunk of text. Okay, so normally you have your subject, which is going to be a few words, right? But if you have a coordinated subject, then you have to hold all of that in your short-term memory before you get to the verb, right? So you have to say embedded sentences and recursion are complex topics, right? So your subject is embedded sentences and recursion, right? That's quite a handful of stuff to keep in mind in your short-term memory. So you're putting a strain on the short-term memory of your hearer or your reader. And then, as I said before, you can have both things together. Okay, so there you have an example where you have the coordination in green and the subordination in red. Okay, so the whole thing is it's a subordinate with a coordinated subject of the subordinate clause. Okay, so that kind of complexity starts getting to be, a little bit taxing on your reader. Okay, so you know, and then there is a coordination within the verb phrase of the subordinate as well, right? So it's a double whammy of coordination and subordination. Okay, so obviously, as you create these sentences that become increasingly more complicated, the cost of processing it goes higher. Okay, so whenever you start your sentence with if one, or if we consider, or it has been said that, keep in mind that you're adding processing effort to your text, that your reader now has to work harder than if you just said it right up front without the hypothetical, without the subordinate clause, without whatever the extra complexity. Okay, so I'm not saying don't do it, it's perfectly fine, but keep in mind that you're making it harder on your reader, not easier. So as I said, recursion can be defined very simply as a unit that occurs in another unit of the same type. Okay, so you can have, for example, a noun phrase that recurs within a noun phrase, right? You know, so sentences may occur within sentences, right? And that's a subordination. Prepositional phrases can have noun phrases that themselves are then modified by a prepositional phrase, okay? So now look at the sentence there that's very colorful, because this is an example of recursion gone amok, right? It has been hypothesized that, and now I'm subordinate clause, embedded sentences and coordinated noun phrases, of course it's a coordinated subordinate clause, are more complex to process and more difficult to understand. Again, my subordinate has a noun predicate here, that's a coordinate, because, and now I'm introducing another coordinate with a coordinating conjunction, subordinating conjunction, sorry, because they require holding in short-term memory more units and more complex units, which can be challenging. That's a relative clause that's modifying. They require holding in short-term memory, etc. And then especially when, so now I'm modifying the whole sentence with an adverbial, the writer is trying to get the complex message across, as I am doing now. Right? And so again, as I am doing now is modifying the thing that's modifying the thing, right? So you see that there's nothing wrong with this sentence, except it's exceptionally complicated to parse. Okay, you may need to reread it a couple of times before you understand what in heaven's name is this guy saying, right? And so that tells you don't do that, okay? Because again, you're adding gratuitously effort to the job of the reader, and that's not a good idea. Your job is to facilitate the reader. Hi, Ari, how are you?
Fine, thank you.
Good. All right. So how do you avoid this kind of complexity, right? I mean, so we've got like a really complicated sentence. Let's say it came out that way. You weren't paying attention, and you reread it, and you're like, oh my God, I created a monster, right? Well, it's actually not that complicated. All you do is break down the complex sentence into simpler units. Okay. So the previous paragraph that was such a complicated thing, you can break it down into 3 sentences, as I've done there, and I'm not going to read it. I'm going to let you look at it yourselves, and you can see that the same meaning is there, except I now have 3 relatively simple sentences that are not as complicated to process as the humongous, mega, multiply embedded sentence that I did before. Okay. Any questions so far?
I'm wondering,
Yep.
is it more common not to write like this? Because a lot of research papers that I've read are written like this.
Yeah, it's not uncommon because being clear is a gift. It is. I mean, I say that because it's like not very many people can do it because it's easier to write this nonsense than to write this. This, I just, wrote it in 2 seconds. This one took me actual work, and that's kind of the point that the overall point of this lecture is it takes effort to be clear. It's very easy to be complicated and difficult. It takes effort to be clear. Clarity comes from work. That's really the biggest point that I have today.
I find myself when I'm reading materials or textbooks, I often find myself that it wasn't so complex because I have to reread passages 2 or 3 times.
Yes, no, and that's true, and that's really the only thing that you can do. When it's really complicated, take a pencil and paper and break it down and see what are they saying. And then when you're done that and you find out that in fact what they were saying was pretty stupid, you get really angry. I mean that's happened to me. When I was a graduate student, I read this book, and I'm not going to name names, but it was a book of government and binding. It was the syntactic theory at the time. And this person was looking at a syntactic phenomenon. And so I read the whole book, and it's like a 250-page book. So it took considerable effort. And then at the end, the conclusion was, something that you ask any undergraduate about it, and they would have said, "Oh, of course, that's what it is." Right? So I'm like, okay, I just read 250 pages for this. The insight that I get at the end is the same thing that I would have gotten from an undergraduate. So I was very upset because I said I've just wasted a week of my life because I didn't need to read this thing. Because if the conclusion in the end is a triviality, then what's the point? Okay? So no, it does happen. It does happen. All right, anything else? All right, so then let's move on to textual clarity. Okay, so far we've talked about sentence level clarity. Okay, I've got a sentence. How do I make it clear, or how do I make it not complicated? Now we move beyond to text, right? So the entire essay level clarity, right? So first of all, the best advice that I can give you is put the information where your audience is expecting it. Okay, and what that means for American academic writing is that your thesis should be at the beginning of your paragraph and should be at the beginning of your text overall. Then you can repeat it at the end, and it's called the conclusion, but it needs to be at the beginning. You need to start your paragraph, you need to start your essay by announcing what your conclusion is going to be. Now, if you're not a native speaker of English, this literally makes no sense. Okay? Because literally it means to say, what do you mean you put your conclusion at the beginning? It's called the conclusion for a reason, right? But no, never mind. In American academic writing, that's the way they do it, and that's where they're going to look for your thesis. If they don't find it, they'll take anything that's at the beginning of your paragraph and they'll say, that's the thesis. And when then your paragraph does not develop that thesis, they will say your paragraph makes no sense, and they will mark you down. Or they will stop reading because they will say, I don't understand what this person is saying. Okay? So the problem of this, and we talked about this last week, is called the linguistic penalty. People don't say, oh, look, this person is using a different rhetorical organization of her paragraphs or his paragraphs. They say this person doesn't know how to write. This person is confused. Okay? So this is very important. Now, for the native speakers, it's just as important because, as it turns out, native speakers don't really have a very clear intuition of these things. And so, you need to pay attention. You need to say, here's where I'm going to put my thesis there, and be conscious that you're doing it. You cannot just wing it. It's just not gonna work. All right. So put the information where people are expecting it. Then, if you use well-known, heavily used rhetorical structures, that's going to help because people then expect the structure of your argument will follow that, right? So pros and cons, right? So if you say, Chomsky's theory has this and this and this and this that are very good ideas, and then that and that and that and that, and those are bad ideas, right? That's a very good, clear, straightforward structure because we're very used to it, and so that we will follow fairly easily that kind of organization. Okay. Another organization that works very well is chronological. If you describe the growth of a field or the changes in a field and you do it in chronological order, then it's a built-in sequence that we know how to process. Something happens, then this happens afterwards, and then this happened afterwards, and this happens afterwards, right? It's how children tell stories. It's a very basic way of organizing things. And the other thing, and this may be controversial, but it's nonetheless true, people expect you to start with the most important argument first, okay? So if you're going to present a series of arguments, your strongest argument, the most important one, the most crucial one, should go first, and then go to other arguments that are less important. Julia, do you mind muting your microphone because you're flipping pages and it's
oh, sorry.
Echoing.
Sorry about that.
No, it's not a problem. Just no problem.
Okay.
Okay. So then the other thing, is so sorry. Talking of muting, I should have muted that, but I don't remember how to mute. So signposting. This is a metaphor, and I want to be very clear about that. So think of chapter titles and section titles as signage on the highway, where you have a sign that says on this way to Dallas, that way to Fort Worth, right? So that's signposting, right? And so the same way that it's very useful when you're on the highway to know which direction the highway goes, it's very useful when you're reading a text to know in what direction the text is going. Okay, and that's what titles, the headers, the subheadings, and so on do for you. Okay, so when you read the section that says theoretical foundations of Chomsky's theory, what do you expect you're going to find in that section? Well, the foundations of Chomsky's theory, right? I mean, what else? Right? If you found something else, you'd be like, whoa, something really bad happened in this book, right? The same thing goes for transitions. Transitions are boring, they're dull, they're not interesting, people don't want to do them, but they're super helpful when you're reading things because you say, all right, so far we've dealt with the theoretical foundations of Chomsky's theory, now we're moving on to the applied aspects of the theory. Brilliant. So now I know what's happening, right? So those help very, very much. And then, of course, what I've labeled here as metalinguistic signposts. If you say, therefore, my conclusion is, what do you think is going to follow? Your conclusion, right? I mean, you need to be really special to then put something else there. Okay? I mean, it's almost like, you're doing it on purpose now, right? So when you put that kind of signpost, right, it makes it very, very easy for the reader to understand what's going on, because then, oh, good, so that's what the author is now doing. So if you say, well, now summing up the argument so far, this is what we've seen. All right, so what follows is a summary of the argument so far, right? So these are very helpful things that that really, can be, super advantageous to the reader because they know what's happening and therefore they can read more easily. And again, keep in mind that everything that we're saying is how to make the reader's life easier. Okay, and we'll return to this. So here's an example from a slide from another class. It's got nothing to do with this, but I just want you to show you. This is the logical organization of one lecture in the class, right? So you have politeness theories, then there's classical rational models, the second wave and the third wave, right? Already you know a bunch of stuff about this subject even before you even read what the text is about, right? So, Eric, what do you know about politeness theories, having seen this? You have to unmute yourself, though. Eric, you're muted.
Yes.
Right. You no longer are muted. Very good.
Okay.
So what do we know about politeness theories just from this?
Wait, from this PowerPoint?
Yes, just from this this part here of the slide here. This part here. What do you know about? What do you know about politeness theories?
There are 3 different kinds of
Brilliant.
movement.
You see my point? You haven't read the word about politeness theories, and you already know that there's 3 kinds. That's more than most people know about politeness, right? That's what I mean. Signposting helps you. You see? And it doesn't require effort. So along these lines, how many models of rational politeness there are that at least I thought were useful to talk about?
Are you talking 3?
Yeah, 3. Very good. Okay. So you see, the signposting already is giving you a ton of information even before you start reading. Okay, and that's the nice thing about it. Now, do you need to put numbers in the headings and subheadings? You can. You don't have to. I like it. Some people hate it. Doesn't matter. You know, but it's your choice. If you like the little numbers, if it helps you, then put them in. If it doesn't help you, don't. Okay. Now, one thing that's important: if you have your headings, have headings. That's good. But don't just rely on the headings. Use also the discursive signposting, such as saying, all right, so we've done the discussion of the rational models. We now turn to the second wave models, the postmodern and discursive models. Okay, so that way the reader knows that you don't just go and blah, 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 Brown and Levinson, blah, blah, blah. No. The second wave begins, so suddenly the reader is reading something different and it's surprising. So never surprise your reader unless you're a mystery novel writing, and then you don't need my advice. All right, so wrapping things up, remember what I said, just write short, positive, clear sentences. Try to remember that your self-worth is not proportional to the length of your sentences. A longer sentences doesn't make you sound smarter. Possibly, it makes you sound dumber. Because if you get your long sentence wrong, then Dr. Attardo underlines it in red in the good old days. Now all you get is an email that says you suck. No, I'm joking. But in the old days, you would have gotten it underlined and you said this sentence is awkward. Or frag. That was my favorite. Frag is fragment, right? And so the teacher would write in the margin frag. One of my friends, his name was Paul Baltus in graduate school, he would write be specific. And so he abbreviated BS. It was a teacher humor. So write simply. Simple is better than complicated. If you can be simple, be simple. It's a sign of maturity. You can use the passive. Don't worry about the passive. It's okay to use the passive. If your high school teacher, meets you, say, Dr. Attardo said it was okay. Or you can say it has been said by Dr. Attardo that using the passive is okay. Remember the thing about the American paragraph structure, especially if you're not a native speaker. You know, by the way, you all know I'm not a native speaker, right? So in this particular case, it's like I speak whereof I know, right? I mean, I had to go through this myself. I wasn't happy at the time. After I figured it out, I was like, oh, that's it? Yes, brilliant. So now everybody says I write clearly. Good. So keep that in mind. And be very careful of books and booklets and websites, etc., purporting to give you advice. Okay, so this quote that I have there comes from a book, otherwise a good book. Okay, I'm not saying that it's a bad book. It's about how to turn your dissertation into a book, and of course the gentleman who wrote the book says clear writing is really important, and he says clear writing is the organization of your thinking. Okay. And you're going, oh, okay, sure, that's very good. Except it's completely untrue. Okay? Because what it really clear writing is writing that fits into the mold that's prescribed by the expectations of your audience, which is a very specific audience of our US academic writers in the 21st century, blah, blah, blah. Okay? And, you know, the way you think has got nothing to do with the clarity of your writing. We're going to talk about it in a second. I went off on a tangent when I prepared these slides, so you'll see in a second. Okay. And by the way, Dr. Pickering has an interesting point, which is probably her idea because she doesn't remember reading it somewhere. But basically, what she says is that in English, the burden of interpretation is on the writer. So in other words, the writer has to write in such a way that the reader has the least amount of effort. In other cultures, and this is true of Italian and French, and I suspect Chinese and Japanese as well, it's the other way around. The burden of the writing is on the reader. Okay, so the writer can get away with a lot because they don't have to spell out their argument in minute detail. Whereas in English, the writer cannot get away with anything because the reader expects the writer to spell out the argument. And if the writer doesn't do it, then the reader says, this is not clear, this is not good, and walks away from the text, which is the worst thing that can happen to you as a writer. All right, so before we get into the second half on clear thinking, any questions about what I've said so far?
I have a comment. That part is very true because I got my master's in French literature, and there were times where I got my papers back, and it was because it wasn't complex enough because I took a class on Proust, and his writing is...
Well, all right, sure. But I mean, Proust is famous for his sentences that go on and on and on and on. You know,
yeah, the burden is on the reader, and
absolutely,
if you don't
yes.
get it, it just means you're not smart.
Right, but also Proust is writing creative writing, right? So here we're not talking about writing. I mean, if I were writing a novel about you know, the decay of aristocracy in France and my being conflicted about my being gay and my memories of childhood, I'd probably use sentences that go on for a couple of pages. You know, but I'm talking about phonies, right? God help us, you know. Very good. By the way, if you have a chance, read Proust, because he's one of the great writers of the world literature. I love Marcel Proust.
Don't do it. Don't do it.
Please leave this room now. Yeah, I am banning you. No, it's wonderful. It's wonderful.
150 pages of one paragraph. And you're like, what? Huh?
Hey.
Huh?
It's art. All right. So let's move on then to clear thinking. Now, Here, let me preface this by saying, whereas what I've said so far, I am 100% sure of, and I'm willing to fight anyone who says any different. Here, I'm sort of going off on a limb, as I said, because now we're outside of linguistics. Okay, we are into psychology, right? I mean, I'm talking to you about how to think clearly, not how to write clearly. Okay, so you see the difference here in what I'm doing. So, but I thought that a good place to start from is a quote by Cato the Elder, who was also known as Cato the Censor, because he was a tough guy. He's the guy who started every speech for a while with Delenda Carthago. We must destroy Carthage, because he was against Carthage. That was the Phoenicians were like fighting with Rome, and they did 3 wars. Anyway, so when he was giving advice about writing, he said, if you grasp your subject, then the words will take care of themselves. Okay? And I find this to be enormously true. Okay? Now, notice that it is a very difficult, it's a very harsh thing to say. Because what it's saying is, if you can't be clear, you just don't understand what you're talking about. If you understood it, you could state it clearly. Okay? And, as I said, yes, it is a bit of on the harsh side of things. Okay? But if you believe that anything can be said clearly, then he's right. Okay? And my experience has been that the more I learned about a subject, the more that subject became clear. And also, the more I became aware that there were parts of the subject that were unclear to me. Okay, so in other words, it's sort of like the more you go deep, you understand it, but then you say, wait a second, I didn't quite understand this little detail here. Then you figure that out, and you find another little detail within that you didn't understand as clearly as you would like. And you go deeper and deeper, it's clearer and clearer. But then there is always a little bit of non-clarity that's left. So the best advice that I can give you on this is read. The more you read about your subject, the better you're off. Okay? Good writing, in the end, is good reading. A lot of reading. Okay? I'll tell you a story which is sort of amuses me. A graduate student who just graduated with me. She started her dissertation a few years ago, and on a topic. And after a while, she came to my office almost in tears, and she said, "Everybody has written about this subject," because she was literally finding thousands of sources on her subject. And I said, "Yes." And she went back and then read them. And then she did her dissertation, But so you see, that's the thing, is you have to read a lot in order to get to understand a little. Okay? And again, it's a bit rough, it's a bit harsh, but it's true. Now, can we organize our thinking more clearly? I think so. So there's ways that we can look at organizing our thoughts. Okay, we're not talking linguistics anymore. We're talking thinking here. We can organize our thoughts in ways that are clearer than others. Okay, so the first one is causality. Okay, so if we understand causality, we have a better chance of being clear. So causality just means that something causes something else. So if you say, I lit a fire and therefore there was smoke, the fire caused the smoke, right? So that's causation. Now, one of the problems that very, very often students and scholars have is to confuse correlation with causation. Okay, so what that means is that you observe fire and you observe smoke. And then you say, therefore, the smoke is caused by the fire. Okay? But it could be something else. For example, there could be a smoke machine, hiding behind, something, right? So then in fact, the smoke comes from the smoke machine and the fire is just a painting, right? So then it's not a real fire, okay? The fact that you see that, so my favorite example of this is somebody did a study and showed very convincingly that scholastic performance, the best predictor of scholastic performance was shoe size. Yeah, the bigger your shoes, the better you did in school. It's a fact, okay? This is not made up, okay? Now, of course, correlation doesn't imply causation, right? It's not that if your shoes are big, you put on bigger shoes and suddenly you're smarter and you do better on your test. But what it is, of course, is that if you have bigger shoes, it means that you're grown more, right? That's what children do. They grow up. The more grown they are, the better they do in school because their mental processing is greater, right? So that's how then there is a correlation between shoe size and scholastic performance. The more developed the child, the better they do in school, right? But of course, shoe size has nothing to do with scholastic performance. Okay, so if you confuse the two, that can cause your thinking to become muddied and unclear. Okay, so you don't want that. If you follow inductive or deductive reasoning, you're good because those are sound ways of reasoning. So you can start from concrete causes and arrive at a general rule. So you say, I observe, this swan and it's white, and this one and it's white, and this one and it's white. I come to the conclusion that swans are white. Okay? Deductive reasoning is the other way around. You start from the general rule and you derive the concrete instances. So you start from all swans are white and you look around and you say, yes, I confirm that the swans are white. Okay? So those are good ways of organizing your thinking. Chronological organization, we talked about it. That's a good way to organize things because it's very intuitive. And it matches causality. Okay? So for example, Skinner writes a book about, a behaviorist book about language. Chomsky reads it. And then after he has read it, he writes a review that refutes it. Right? It would be very hard to write the review before having read the book. You see what I'm saying? So usually chronology and causality go hand in hand. But it's not necessarily the case. Okay, so it could be, for example, that Chomsky was unaware of the fact that Tesnier in France had come up with a syntactic theory that did the same thing that his did in a different formalism a few years before. Okay, in fact, he didn't know. Okay, so the fact that things happen before and after doesn't necessarily mean that one causes the other. That's a fallacy. There you have another example. Mary and John are a couple, are dating in high school. They go to separate colleges and then they break up. Well, they didn't break up because they went to college, right? That the chronological sequence doesn't mean that causality, that is causally related. You don't know why they broke up. You would have to go and ask them. Okay, all you know is that one thing happened after the other thing. Okay, but causation isn't necessarily there. Now, another way of being clear is to use a narrative. Now, this is a difficult subject because narrative is not a sound logical argument. Let's be very clear about this. Okay, but it's a good way of organizing knowledge because we love, as human beings, cognitively, narratives. Okay? So for example, look at these two explanations of World War II. Okay? One is, we went to war against Germany and Japan to fight the Nazis for freedom and democracy. By the way, they should have Italians as well. I forgot. All right? And then the other one is, colonial powers fought for the control of global commerce. Okay? Which of the two is more likely to make you join the army and go fight? Anyone? Any thoughts?
So we the first one
The first one. Okay, why the first one?
because it's active. It includes we, the pronoun we. So
Well, it's active, very good, yes, but, you know, fighting Nazis, that's Indiana Jones, right? You know, when I say fighting Nazis, what do you think? Anyone? I mean, to me, it's Indiana Jones fighting with Nazis on a train in the jungle and so on, right? I mean, it's like, it's a very exciting thing. Colonial powers fighting for control of global commerce, you know, I'm already asleep by the end of the sentence. Okay, and by the way, these are caricatural descriptions of the causes of World War II, but I was just trying to give a feeling for the example. So the point here is that if you're telling a story, in the first sentence is good versus evil. You have the bad Nazis and we go fight them for freedom, democracy. Those are good things. Showing colonial powers that fight against each other and there is no right or wrong, it's just like, you know, they wanted to dominate the world economy and so they fight with each other because they couldn't find a way of doing it without fighting. It's not a rousing story. Okay, and so it will be perceived as less clear because there is no narrative. You know, that's why every Hollywood movie is a redemption story. Guy meets girl, guy screws up, guy goes through hardship, sacrifices himself, gets girl back, learns about his problems. That's every single Hollywood movie except for The Lord of the Rings. Okay, why? Because these are easy things that we're built in to like, and so we perceive them as clear. We perceive the narrative arc as being clear and straightforward and linear. Okay, that's why great art, on the other hand, is completely against this. Okay, so how many of you have seen Rashomon, one of the greatest movies ever made? Kurosawa? No. All right. So this is a movie about is a Japanese director, and it's a movie about a crime, right? And it's told by 3 different people, and you see the same scene, but each time it's a completely different event because they're seeing it from their perspective. So in one case, the aggressor is the victim, in the other case, the victim is the aggressor, etc., right? So in other words, it's the same story, but seen from different eyes, and it repeats the same thing. That's not a linear narrative. There's no good guy and bad guy.
Now I know which movie you're talking about, Doctor.
All right, very good.
It's a great one. I've seen it.
Yes, you know, but my point is, it's a complicated story.
Yeah.
In Indiana Jones and the Temple of Doom, or whatever it's called, it's very clear who's the good guy. Right? I mean, you don't have to ask yourself questions there. It's obvious who's the good guy. That's why it's perceived as clear. Okay, whereas you know, a movie like Rashomon is considered complicated. It's difficult because you have to work to understand what's going on. So if you're trying to be clear, then pick a narrative that's straightforward, but be careful because it's not a sound logical argument. That's my point. All right, another way of thinking clearly is to organize your thoughts in patterns that are, again, familiar. So we like parallelisms, okay? So X is to Y like W is to Z, okay? Chomsky is to Skinner like, and then you put in two more scholars, and now you know that the first guy refuted the second guy, right? Compare and contrast. X is like Y except for Z. Okay, so Langacker is like Chomsky. They both created a major theory, except Langacker founded his own meaning. Okay, so compare and contrast. Okay, another thing that again is a rhetorical figure, but gives us a feeling of clarity is repetition, because you recognize something that's repeated. It's like a beat, but it's a semantic beat, right? So if you listen to the "I Have a Dream" speech by Martin Luther King Jr. Sorry, Senior. What am I saying? Sorry, I'm off with the phrase here. If you listen to the speech, "I have a dream" is repeated 5 times, right? So you got "I have a dream, I have a dream." So it comes in as a rhythm, right? And so therefore you recognize the phrase that's coming, and so you prepare yourself for it, and then you say, okay, I have a dream of what? And it's a new argument. Of what? And it's a new argument, right? And so that gives you clarity because you know what to expect. Because he's built in that whenever he says, I have a dream, you know that something is coming that he wants, right? And so that builds clarity. Okay, this is probably the most complicated point that I'm going to try and make here, is that there is a way, and again, we're talking about thinking here, not about writing, okay? Clarity as a continuous chain of deduction. And what does that mean? When you have a logical argument, right, you go from a premise to a conclusion, okay? And there is a chain of arguments that goes between your premise and your conclusion, okay? So here's an example. You start from the premise, I paid my bill on time. If I paid on time, it follows that I'm not at fault. If I am not at fault, it follows that I should not be penalized, because you only penalize people who are at fault, right? If I should not be penalized, I shouldn't have to pay a late fee, right? So this is an argument that you go from a premise, I paid my bill on time, to a conclusion, the credit card shouldn't charge me a late fee, right? And what you have in between is a chain of argument, okay? And if the argument and the chain of argument are too far apart, or there is a gap between them, then you get a faulty argument or a weak argument. Okay, so let me give an example of this. One day, I was having a conversation with a colleague, and we were talking about behaviorism, and I said, you know, behaviorism really never recovered from Chomsky's rebuttal of Skinner. So the guy turns out that he was a neo-behaviorist. There is such a thing. And I said, well, how can you, even do that, right, after this? And he said, oh, well, we don't reject mentalism, right? And I thought, what? Okay, so now let's try and reconstruct what his argument was. His argument was, since we don't reject mentalism, the criticism that Chomsky made of Skinner is no longer valid. Because basically what Chomsky is saying is, if you don't have a mind, then you cannot process language. You need a mind to process language, right? So they say, well, we don't reject the mind, therefore the argument is no longer applies, right? Well, so far so good. The problem is that one of the basic tenets of behaviorism is that you don't need to postulate the mind. Okay, that's why it's called behaviorism. That is, that behavior is all that you get to postulate. You observe it, it's there, it's behavior. Everything else should be rejected. So in fact, you cannot have a mentalist behaviorism. It's a contradiction in terms, okay? So this is a weak argument. It's a case in which the chain of argument falls apart. Or maybe it doesn't fall apart, but it's too far away for me, and I assume you, but if you can figure it out, send me an email. What in heaven's name this guy was thinking when he said, well, we don't reject mentalism. Okay, so this is an example, sort of a negative example. You shouldn't think like this. It's confused thinking. It's fallacious thinking. Okay, so instead, if you follow this, the chain of argument that goes from a premise to a conclusion without interruption, without jumping, that is a strong, valid, and clear argument. Okay, in fact, if it is true that you paid your bill on time, the credit card will remove the late fee. Because an argument like this cannot be beaten. Okay, so there's a useful bit of information if you ever have to pay your credit card late. All right, so wrapping things up, yes, you can write clearly. It's possible. You can do it. Avoid linguistic complexity. Complex sentences, embedded sentences, that kind of stuff. Provide guidance in your text, signpost. Meet the expectations of your audience, rhetorically speaking. In other words, put the information where they want to see it at the beginning with the thesis. Make your thinking clear by understanding your subject as much as you can and by following sound reasoning. Use rhetorical structures that highlight the logic of your argument. In other words, put things in ways that people expect to find them, like compare and contrast, parallelisms, those things. Final conclusion, which I've already anticipated, you can't improvise any of this. You can't whip up sound reasoning at the drop of a hat. Good writing takes time. You have to think about it for a long time. You have to build the argument in your head, test it, prove it, work on it, look at it from the other side, play it backwards, all of that, before you can be sure that, yeah, it is a sound argument. It's an argument that resists testing, therefore it's good. And now you can make it clear, okay? So you cannot improvise this. You cannot say, I've got an hour left, let me write this paper. You need to do it over an extended period of time because you need to have given it a lot of thought, and you need to read as much as you can in order to be thinking the right things that you need to think about for your argument to come through. Okay, so that's really the big conclusion of this. Yeah, it can be done, but it takes time to do it properly. All right. Questions? Stun the silence. That's the way I like it. Did any of this make sense? Yeah, I see nodding. All right. All right, so any questions, anyone, before we wrap this up?
I'm wondering where we should be, at what point we should be in our research, at how much we should have read by now, or
well, how much I cannot say because it really depends on the individual, on the individual project. But you should be getting to the point where you're beginning to see trends in what you read. You should see, oh, this guy is making this argument as the other guy did. Or, oh, look, here somebody's making an argument that's different from that guy. They disagree on this. You should beginning to see patterns in your sources. So that's where you should be. If you're still just reading and it's all new, that's fine. Just keep going. Just make sure that it's narrow enough and keep reading until you start seeing patterns forming. That's where you should be, and that you should be working on your annotated bibliography. Basically, it's a long way of saying you should be working on your annotated bibliography. Anything else?
Yes.
Yes.
Okay, so I thought when I read the first notes at the beginning of class, it says our thesis, and we're supposed to problematize it. It needs to be a question. Where does that come in at?
What do you mean it needs to be a question?
I thought I have read that earlier in my notes in the first part of the class. I don't know, maybe I got it out of context, but I thought I had read that in your notes. So I was just wondering, where does that come in?
Well, okay, I'm not sure that I remember using those terms, but I mean the point is you need to have an issue that you're dealing with, right? There has to be something that you're looking at. So what is your topic that you're working on?
So how, because like we had said, how everybody thinks the ESL, if they hear that it's going to be a good community resource. So I'm supposed to say on the flip side, why is it not a good community resource? Why English as a second language, like if it's offered in community-based centers, is not a good resource.
Okay. So, no, I told you to problematize it in the sense that if you say community-based ESL is a good thing, sure, so is ice cream. I mean, is anybody going to argue that ice cream is not a good thing? Right? I mean, we all agree ice cream is great. We can't eat it because we're on a diet and whatever, but ice cream is great, right? Everybody agrees ice cream is great. Well, so of course, community-based ESL, that's great. You can't write a paper saying ice cream is great, right? I mean, because it's obvious, right? I mean, it's like, what are you going to say about it that's not, yeah, it is great, woohoo, right? You see what I'm saying? So that's why I said you need to problematize it and say, well, is it necessarily great? Might there be problems? What if the people who deliver your ESL, your community-based ESL program, are not good teachers? They're not certified. They don't know what they're doing. They're doing more damage than good. That's the only way that you can make your topic interesting enough to be worth writing about.
Yes. Okay. I understand now.
Okay.
Thank you.
Yes.
Is it more so going against what we're researching, or?
Well, that's just this specific topic because the topic that where she started from was, well, community-based ESL programs are good. I agree, right? I mean, we all agree because I mean, like, what could be wrong with that, right? They're free. They help people who don't have access to ESL programs. I mean, it's like saying helping the homeless is a good thing. Yes, of course it is. I mean, like, well, what? It's not, right? I mean, so if you really want to write a paper about this, you got to come up with something, more interesting to stay at a very superficial level than, oh, it's a good thing, right? I mean, you need to go deeper, and one way of going deeper is to problematize it, right? So that's why, now, if your topic is not an obvious given, then you don't need to do this. This is just a specific situation that this particular project requires because of the nature. I mean, it's a very interesting topic because but I mean, there's other ways of problematizing it. Okay, so for example, you could say, all right, so who's doing it? Who are delivering community projects? But that requires enormous amount of time and research, which we don't have available for a paper that you have to do in 15 weeks. But if you had like a lifetime, yeah, sure, that'd be a great topic to go and research. You go to every church in Dallas and you ask, do they have an ESL program and who teaches it, and meet with the person. Yeah, it'd be a fantastic study. But it takes forever to do. Okay, so that's why I suggested problematizing it that way. Okay? But that's not something that everybody needs to do.
Right.
It's a very specific suggestion. All right. Anything else?
The paper we submitted for last week, overall, how was that? Or
Overall, what do you mean?
like how was it, or where are we as far as what you kind of wanted to see? Was it well,
You mean as a class, the class as a whole? Oh yeah, no, pretty good. Yeah. No, I was happy.
Oh.
I mean, generally speaking, if I'm not happy, I'll let you know. All right. Anything else? All right. Okay. Then I'll let you go, and this will be posted online. Ideally tonight. If we're lucky, we'll have it up tonight. All right. So bye, everybody.
Good night.
Thank
Bye.
you.